Hello, my friends, from our chapel here at St. Peter's in the Loop. We celebrate the sixth Sunday of Easter. And the readings today, especially that from the Acts of the Apostles and then, of course, the Gospel of John, show us that as we get closer to the great festival of Pentecost in a couple of weeks, that the role of the Spirit comes to the forefront of everything that we preach about, everything that we read, and everything that we actually pray about too. And we enter this Sunday with a beautiful image from the very first days of the church and the Council of Jerusalem. And don't liken it to anything like the Second Vatican Council with 2,500 bishops from around the world. It was much tinier scale than that, of course, but what it implies, though, as a council, is that the leaders of the church communities in that part of the world around Jerusalem and Antioch came together, most notably James, Peter, Barnabas, and Paul. And one of the problems that drew them together to discuss was the whole aspect of people coming to believe in Jesus who were either raised in the Jewish faith or Gentiles, those who were not Jewish in origin, and yet they came to believe in the risen Lord. And so you can assume that any Gentile who joins your Jews for Jesus group will follow the usual practice of proselytes. So that meant that the Gentiles, in certain circumstances and places like Jerusalem, the Gentiles took on the practice of Torah, including for males circumcision. And then Paul, as he began his ministry as a converted Jew, so to speak, is allowing Gentiles to join the group of Christians without taking up Jewish practices. And so it developed into a great concern of who belongs and what do you need to belong to this Christian community. Unless you are circumcised according to Mosaic practice, you cannot be saved. That was a prevalent thought and belief in certain areas, like around Antioch. And this is actually the first major crisis of the early church. And so it necessarily meant for leaders to come together. And most scholars of the Bible and the New Testament in particular agree that it probably took more than one meeting or one session, like Luke presents it in his Acts. And for the evangelist, they are the discourses of the earthly Jesus placed in the context of the Last Supper. I specifically mean John here. And John looks beyond the death and resurrection of Christ to his glorification, which, and this is important, releases the Holy Spirit, so to speak. So thus, in the early church, the whole of 50 days included the celebration of the gift of the Holy Spirit. And here we're listening to a promise fulfilled at Easter, and it's critical for our understanding here. In the fourth gospel, the risen Christ is the one who conveys the gift of the Spirit to his disciples on Easter Sunday evening, not 40 or 50 days later. The Spirit is, as in the letters of Paul, the gift of the risen Christ. It is in the gift of the Spirit that the Son and the Father come and make their home in the hearts of disciples. And I hope this is clear for your understanding of the theology of the Trinity, for one thing, but also our understanding of New Testament literature that makes it clear that the Spirit is the one who guides the church in decision-making. That's probably most critical for our understanding of what we're going through in Oak Park these days with Renew My Church, and how we work together in a synod or a gathering of believers to discern the Holy Spirit or the will of God for who we are in the future as a Catholic community in the town of Oak Park. And Jesus, very clearly here in the Last Supper, chapter 14 of John, says that the function of the Spirit is to teach you all things and to bring about in your remembrance everything that I've said to you. So the work of Christ in terms of revealing who God is was finished once he was resurrected and ascended into heaven. And remember, on Easter Sunday evening, after the resurrection, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." There it is. And so it's not the work of the Spirit to convey always new revelations about God. The role of the Spirit is to help us understand, interpret, and apply ever new ways of seeing the once and for all revelation of God in Jesus Christ. That's what is meant by his words, everything that I have said to you, that we constantly remember some of his great commands besides love one another, love your enemies. And nowadays, it's exasperating what sometimes we are made to do when we have to toss up that command of Jesus to love our enemies, and then, on the other hand, to face the facts of the violence that we see in our city streets, overseas, and around the world. So going back to the Acts of the Apostles and what we learn here, the Jerusalem Council determines that the mission to the Gentiles, those who are not Jewish, is the will of God, and that they do all in their power to cooperate with this divine initiative. And so the disciples there, in their prayer and discernment, decide on a policy that both honors the tradition and adjusts to ever-changing circumstances in their world. And so they asked that the Gentile believers keep a minimum of rules from the Judaic tradition, which means they had to obey certain dietary restrictions and marriage laws, and improper slaughtering of animals, kosher, and that lasted only a little while longer in the long history of our church. And they decided that for males, circumcision was not necessary in order to join the Christian community. What we learn here through the Acts of the Apostles and here the final discourse of John in chapter 14 is that our Easter faith entails a remarkable belief that the Spirit of God continues to work through every human process of decision-making in our church. Luke's paradigm here of the Council of Jerusalem and the outpouring of the Holy Spirit urges us to take seriously both our religious experience and our tradition, to trust that the Spirit of God works even especially through endless debate, exhausting meetings, and even sometimes hesitant leadership. Because when we allow the Spirit, as Pope Francis so often does, when we allow the Spirit to take over the reins of leadership and guiding the church into the future, it's difficult for us human beings many times because we have to let go of our own power and our own way of doing things, our own will. So, my friends, let us continue to celebrate these great 50 days by learning ever more and more about the will of God. And now, as we near the end of the Easter season, we learn more and more about the role of the Spirit of Jesus himself present among us. As he said to them on Easter evening, those timid little disciples locked away in the upper room, "Peace I give you, my peace I leave you.